Hello, and welcome to Regulated Roots, the series that takes you behind the scenes of the cannabis industry's most influential brands and talented minds behind them. I am your host, Kimberly Simms, and today I am thrilled to be here with Eric Goepel, founder and CEO of Veterans Cannabis Coalition and a government affairs professional. Over the course of this conversation, we are going to talk politics. So, this isn't a first date and it's not a holiday table. So, we are just going to jump in and get going. Eric is going to shed some light on how this election cycle could reshape the legal and regulatory environment. And we will explore the very profound impact of the upcoming elections on federal cannabis reform. Politics and policy are obviously intrinsically linked, and understanding this dynamic is a really critical part for anyone that is involved in the cannabis sector. So please join us, tune in as we uncover the strategic maneuvers, the legislative shifts that could redefine the industry. And whether you're a seasoned professional or a curious observer, I know that this episode will provide some really interesting insight into the power of politics and how it crafts the laws that govern our cannabis world. So let us waste no time. We have so much to talk about. Eric, thank you so much. Welcome to Regulated Roots. I am thrilled to be joined by you today. And I would love for you to just kick it off by sharing some of your experience and background with our audience.
So thank you for having me, Kimberly, and glad to be here. Just briefly about myself. I'm a U.S. military veteran. Which is one of my main tie to the Veterans Cannabis Coalition. I served for about 7 years in the Army, did a couple tours in Iraq, got out, went back to school, ended up in D.C. Working on national security and veterans affairs policy, which ultimately led to me going independent as a lobbyist, organizer, advocate, wearing a few different hats. And working on cannabis policy, and in particular as it relates to veterans over the last 6+ years now. So one of the first bills, for example, we lobbied on was the first bill to make it through a congressional first cannabis reform bill, to make it through a congressional committee, which would be the VA Medicinal Cannabis Research Act of 2018, which was sponsored by now Governor, then Ranking Member Tim Walz. For example. So, the cannabis policy, I think it spreads in a lot of different directions, and veterans, especially at the federal level, are often at the center of that. So, it's important, I think, for veterans to have, some good representation in a lot of these conversations, as much as, any individual can claim to represent, any number of veterans. The millions of veterans who use cannabis. I can't really claim that, but I think we have a good strategy, and I think we try to do our best to make a good case on the Hill.
Well, I know I speak on behalf of myself, but I'm sure everyone that's tuning in, and we thank you so much for your service and, of course, continued dedication to making sure that veterans have access to the medicine that they need. So thank you so much for that. All right. So, Eric, you and I were chatting earlier this week as we were getting ready to record this. And, I tried to sort of pigeonhole you into what do you like? Which candidate do you think would be best for XYZ? And what about that candidate? And, I thought that was your response. I found to be very interesting, because typically we see people that really hone in on particular candidates and particular races, but you really talked about it not necessarily being about the who, but about what they can do. And I would love for you to just share with the audience sort of, what is your view of electoral politics and races in general?
Well, great. Nice deep questions to dive right into. So I think again, take it's my perspective, so take that for what it's worth. But, in my experience, I think dealing with elected officials and the nature of politics, it's understanding, these folks aren't your friends, right? There's no parasocial relationship that you should feel between yourself and elected officials, right? They are, by definition, servants of the people. So when you're asking yourself, why don't politicians do X, Y, or Z? one of the first things is generally they're not being asked, right? And if they are, they're not being asked in a way that I think would be compelling in most cases. And that's not to say that it's like, oh, so easy, right? No, I mean, advocacy is by definition challenging because you're trying to change, the status quo, and, inertia is what it is. So it's that is always a very difficult and uphill challenge and that never changes no matter what the issue you're working on, whether it's cannabis or veterans affairs or anything else. So if you understand that it takes years, if not decades, and it takes and so you see that it's independent of individual politicians, because legalization started with Nixon, and it's gone through the drug war, the current modern drug war kicked off with Nixon, 1971, still going strong in most ways today, and obviously it's taken tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, arguably millions of voters to start to slowly change the direction of that ship. And that's not just as it relates to cannabis policy, but drug decriminalization, de-incarceration efforts or decarceration efforts, criminal justice reform efforts. There, a lot of components in there. And again, what politician is responsible for any of that? They're not. Like, yes, there are people that signed off on those bills, and yes, there's people that voted for them, but and for the most part, it's not the offices that write the legislation. It tends to be the advocates, the lobbyists, that contribute a lot of what becomes, the language of the law. Now, obviously, members of Congress, especially if they take a keen interest in the issue, often take a leadership role and play a much more direct role in shaping that legislation into like granular detail. But, there's always areas that they're not going to be an expert in, that they're going to invite, other voices, to basically share, their perspective and the insights into the issue. So, for example, legalization covers so many, cannabis legalization touches on nearly, every area of government, right? Yeah, so like for any one person or, organization or member of Congress to claim to be an expert into all areas that legalization will touch, I mean, that's almost impossible to claim with kind of a straight face, right? So we all have our niche, and we all have, an area where we focus on, and that's kind of the point, right? Like we're not, I'm not dependent on who's in office, because the issues don't really change that quickly, where that's really going to matter on the short term, but in the bigger picture, right? Like, it does matter who's in office, because you can see when legislation moves and when it doesn't. Which I think would be maybe a better segue to get talk about the House. But like, for example, right, like the Safe Banking Act moved 7 times under Democratic, under Democratic administration or Democratic House leadership, and has moved 0 times, under Republican. So I mean, and that was, or same with the MORE Act, right, which was a legalization and criminal justice reform bill that moved twice, under the House Democrats. They voted in favor of, yes, we're in favor of legalization, we're in favor of additional criminal, justice reform, restorative justice elements, and that consolidated a lot of Democratic, and that was 3-4 years ago. I know, so it's not as though, So we're in a moment, I think, where you can see that like things are changing, but it's really on, advocates, organizers, voters to kind of recognize that it's, that there's a long game here, and that, you need to kind of recognize that like this isn't going to be a primary issue for most elected officials. So like, how do you change that? Like,
and
we talked about the first question
a little bit too, right? Like I think I said like cannabis legalization and reform is the most important thing to us, right? As it is our livelihood. But when you look at when you zoom out, right, and you look at the broader picture and the things that are going on in this country, it isn't a top priority for a lot of elected officials. So, that I think I've always sort of thought about it as a really easy trading card as well for politicians, in terms of trying to get things passed. Like, it's all deal making, right? We know that. I don't think anyone tuning in is going to be like, oh my God, it's deal making. Like, I haven't said, dropped any.
Politics is compromise, the art of compromise.
Yeah. And so I think it's a really easy trading card as well, because it doesn't rank as like the most important thing. And so I think you're right about that. It's not necessarily who is in office, it's what we as the industry, as voters, as donors, what as lobbyists, what we can do and how we can educate them and move that ball forward. It's challenging though. Change is a slow moving animal. But I read the other day, I actually haven't fact checked this, but I typically get my news from legitimate sources. That there's like a recording that was released that Nixon was like, yeah, marijuana isn't actually that dangerous at all.
Well, and Nixon commissioned before the enactment of the Controlled Substances Act and the creation of the DEA and essentially the launch of the modern drug war in '71. He had commissioned like a group of like high profile government officials and experts to essentially examine what should be done with cannabis, and they came back with decriminalization, right? And that was 50 plus years ago. So again, like this is where it's like all the solutions for almost all of our political ills are usually obvious and have been obvious for years, if not decades, in most cases.
Yeah,
it's really just
right.
How do you pull that political will together to actually make that change happen? Especially once once the drug war kicks off, and you now create this entire ecosystem of agencies and law enforcement that are basically benefiting from prohibition. Right. Yeah. And now you've created a financial incentive for a huge swath of the criminal justice system to sort of see that like, marijuana prohibition, creates a steady flow of people into the justice system at some level, even if it's just arrests, even if it never leads to conviction, 100%. But obviously has led to hundreds of thousands or millions of convictions, varying levels. So
we'll focus more on federal change in a little bit, but I want to just zoom in here and talk about some of the key states on top of my mind as a former Floridian, having lived for 8 years in the Sunshine State. I visit there frequently. I am particularly interested in chatting about Florida's evolving landscape. So we have Amendment 3 set on the ballot, which aims to legalize adult use cannabis. And that's clear that if that passes, it'll be a very significant change. So I've got a bunch of questions as we talk about Florida, and I'll try and kind of just go one by one, so I don't ask you to remember 500 questions all in one. But, the first thing I want to chat about is, given your expertise in government relations and policy, how do you foresee the potential passage of Amendment 3 impacting Florida's cannabis market, but also, the broader federal reform landscape?
Well, so Florida, it's the third largest state by population in the U.S. It is, the largest, medical only market left. Mm-hmm. And, it would obviously, shift from serving, I think the medical patient count in Florida is somewhere just south of 1 million people. Okay. To potentially millions very, mm-hmm. Very quickly, especially when you account for Florida's, massive tourism, the amount of tourism that Florida receives on a regular basis. So, obviously it'd be a huge, win, for, mm-hmm. I guess the tax base, right. And for access, because, for a variety of reasons, and one of them, I think that Florida, for example, their medical recommendations are only good for like 8 to 9 months. They're not even good for like a full calendar year.
I think that's right.
Yeah, and they usually are more expensive. Mm-hmm. In the few $100 range. I believe they do require like an in-person visit. Mm-hmm. Like, so it's not something you can do through telehealth, which usually helps cut down costs significantly.
Do you remember in our Prop 215 days here in California when you could just like zoom into 420 Doc and you can get your...
you can still do that.
I don't think it's a real moneymaker for those doctors anymore. But
for patient access, I mean, being a patient in California, for example, right, means that you can possess up to 8 ounces legally versus the 1 ounce that's limited to adults. But with Florida, obviously, so adult, shifting from a pretty restrictive medical only market to, obviously a full adult use market, 21 and over, that's a huge shift in access, and that impacts every adult in the state. So, that's a win without a doubt. So, but there's no home grow. There's obviously a great argument to make that this initiative really solidifies, a handful of multi-state operator.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that.
And they're and gives them essentially gives them a mini monopoly in the state, and just solidifies their existing control.
Right, yeah.
It's
there's
obviously
also no social equity program, right? So I know there was no home grow, but I also, please correct me if I'm wrong, that there aren't any provisions in Amendment 3 for social equity. So I mean, imperfect to be sure.
Right. So I mean, it's an imperfect law or imperfect amendment. That's clear. But at the same time, if you were going to look at it from like a lowest common denominator, obviously shifting a state of more than 20 million people into full adult use is a huge shift. I mean, that now expands, the number of Americans who fall into, adult use states significantly.
Yeah.
And obviously, Florida has 2 Republican senators, right?
And it does.
And I'm not saying, and it's not easy, and it's not like it's been an easy shift. And I haven't really seen this anywhere, to be honest. But, there are now more and more Republican senators and dual Republican, a Republican delegation that are now representing adult use states that are still anti-legalization as far as the record holds. So this is just a way for at the state level to start putting more pressure on the federal delegations from these states to start backing legalization measures at the federal level, because once the voters basically, especially at a 60%, which is required, a supermajority of Floridians are going to need to say yes.
Right? Isn't it? Yeah. The last,
I think it's 64. I think maybe some of the last polling I've seen.
64. But what's interesting,
either way,
is and you and I chatted about this a little bit too, and then I did some follow-up research myself because I don't think I had realized quite the depth of what I'm about to mention. Is that so? This is per our conversation, and then again, I did a little bit more reading. So according to Public Records and MJ Biz Daily, Drug Policy Alliance, DPP, and Marijuana Policy Project are not at the forefront of this adult use campaign, and instead, we're starting to see a shift of some of the more marijuana industry funded campaigns. So I thought that was super interesting. I want to chat about that a little bit more, some of the pros and cons of this strategy and how you think, and you sort of already foreshadowed that. But let's talk about that a little bit more, because usually, we see DPP and MPP as really leading the charge here, and that's not the case this time. And I think there are numerous reasons why, but I'd love to talk about that strategy and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I as far as why Drug Policy Alliance or marijuana Policy Project, New Approaches PAC, NORML, which are kind of the have been like the usual suspects in medical and adult use legalization efforts. I'd say prior to 2018,
for sure.
And have kind of been but again, like I think they've been victims of their own success to a large extent, in that they were able, a lot of their basis of support, basically states that were very pro legalization, have legalized.
Right.
And so, the immediate need, and the immediate pressure of prohibition has largely been lifted from, almost half the country at this point.
Which is great. But then I think they're having a difficult time with funding.
Right. Because, again, I'd say they're victims of their own success to that in a way right there. And that's reflected as well in the fact that they were, especially at NORML and MPP were earlier in the year kind of exploring, merging. They've both seen, they've both seen a significant drop in, fundraising and everything else. And listen, there's a lot of great advocates and organizers that still work and have come out of both MPP and NORML over the years. But I guess Florida is the counterexample where, there was no way that, MPP and NORML were going to be able to dump, the $90 million that the MSOs have currently put into Amendment 3.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because I'm not sure that, all the viewers are aware of that. And I think it's super,
it's a pretty staggering number.
Yes. And one, I think, if you want to give away it's not a secret, but there's one in particular, one MSO in particular that I believe is
True Leaf. It's public record.
Right. But I don't, I think the average cannabis consumer or even operator isn't necessarily digging into that minutia. Maybe if you're in Florida, right? Or if you're, but that's wild to me.
It's, this is politics is politics about following the money.
Yep.
Right. Because where you see money flow, that's where things move usually. Yep. I mean, again, it's not a 100% guarantee that just because you dump, let's say, $100 million to this campaign, it could still be defeated, right? I've seen, especially in DC, very well-financed lobbying campaigns go down to stunning defeats, even when the people doing the lobbying have a lot of influence, right? So, I mean, it's I'd say more normally things work kind of as you would expect, though, right? People that are spending money, generate, building influence, building relationships with people who hold, make decisions on the issues that they care about or that are essential to them, right? Like that's just how politics has worked, I guess, forever. I mean, we didn't invent this.
No.
Yeah.
And that's why you were saying, to link back to a few minutes ago, why, one of the, for better or worse, the things that we will likely see come out of Florida adult use is a small number of MSOs who will likely dominate the market. But, another thing, which is like an adjacent topic, I suppose. But when I was researching Amendment 3, I saw that there was quite a bit of opposition from hemp operators. And I think that, I just want to touch on this because I think, we're seeing that in California here. This is like a growing, no pun intended, but like a growing divide within the industry. So can you just touch on that for, just a few minutes, and then we'll kind of shift gears to good old Nebraska.
Yeah. So, I think this is that, it was a strategy, and I think a pretty solid one to kind of separate industrial hemp from cannabis, basically cannabis grown to produce cannabinoids, right?
Yes.
Whatever those are, whether it's CBD or anything else, right? And that's what resulted in the 2018 Farm Bill and basically the descheduling of hemp as arbitrarily defined as being under 0.3% THC by weight, right? That, again, I don't think almost anyone really expected the loophole. I mean, I think chemists probably well understood that, like, hey, once you it's like if you're going to deschedule hemp-derived derivatives, which include pretty much any cannabinoid that exists in the plant, including THC, right? Then couldn't you? And now we've seen this kind of play out in courts and across the states and everything else. And it's become clear, though, that like the hemp industry, I'm sure, has good actors, but every time that there's a blind secret shopper shelf test of hemp products that are on the legal market, gas stations or convenience store, wherever they're being sold, right? Mislabeled, underweight, overweight, has THC, too much THC, not
not enough THC,
or other cannabinoids, other additives or contaminants, and it's just like this is all this just invites the kind of desperation that we're seeing, I think, right now, which is this has become a race to the bottom for everybody.
Yes, and we are literally seeing that play out here in California, which again, this like a whole other segment and topic.
Sure.
But maybe offline we'll chat more about that. But in the interest of time, I want to switch gears just for a couple minutes to Nebraska, because what I think is interesting about Nebraska is that they're one of the few remaining states without any sort of regulated marijuana program. And they're
one of the outliers.
Yeah, one of the outliers. And they're the race to the ballot has been, fraught with controversy. It wasn't even until I think like a few days ago, maybe, that we were certain that Nebraskan voters would have an opportunity. So, there's two initiatives that have now been certified in the face of a local lawsuit, as well as a statewide investigation as to whether enough signatures were valid. So just again, we'll speak briefly there are, as I said, there are two, and I will just sort of tee it up for you here. But you've got the Nebraska Medical Cannabis Regulation Act, which would legalize possession, manufacturing, distribution, delivery, and dispensing of cannabis for medical purposes, and would create like a commission to oversee everything. And then the Nebraska Medical Cannabis Patient Protection Act, which would set the allowable amount of medical cannabis at 5 ounces and would exempt patients and caregivers from using or assisting someone else in using the cannabis, and would also require a written recommendation from a healthcare practitioner. So again, it wasn't until a few days ago that we knew this would be on the ballot, and I don't think it's out of the woods yet. From again what I was reading, there's a gentleman named, I believe, John. I don't know if I'm going to say his last name right. Do you know how to pronounce it? Kuhn, Kuehn.
Yeah, I think that's Kuhn. Yeah,
Kuhn. Let's roll with that.
Yeah.
Kuhn. We'll say Kuhn. He was a vet and a rancher who actually previously served as the Nebraska on the legislature, and he has already filed a challenge, and he's basically arguing that the Secretary of State hasn't provided appropriate access to the petition pages, and that he's made a public records request and asked for independent review. And so the lawsuit basically asks the Lancaster County District Court to either prevent Nebraskans from voting on the measure or prevent the Secretary of State and other constitutional officers from certifying the results of those measures. So, as always, nothing in our world is simple. I know you don't actually have a crystal ball, but if you did, give it a shake. How do you see this, how do you see this playing out? Do you think there's even a chance that they'll pass? Like, what is the sentiment?
Yeah, I can't, I can't speak directly to the situation in Nebraska, but what I guess I could, take a step back and look at kind of how legal challenges have unfolded in other more conservative states that have tried to pass medical programs, and that's maybe Mississippi, South Dakota, Kansas, and a few others. Basically, if there's not a referendum process in place, or if the referendum process, because it's different in every state, and it doesn't even exist in every state. But if it either doesn't allow for that, so you have to go through the legislature, or the referendum process allows for the legislature or the courts to, a great deal of latitude as to, how they interpret, given section, or be able to challenge, the language of a ballot or whatever, right? Like once you get into the court, basically, I feel like there's any number of ways where these things can basically be excluded or disqualified.
Yeah.
And especially when you already have the court and the legislature and the governor, basically when the three branches of government are aligned and saying and not being in favor of something, they can definitely find any number of legal ways, I think, to kill popular sentiment like that. So we'll see if it basically happens like that in Nebraska. The counterexample would be Oklahoma, where the legislature did try to interfere with the implementation and then lost in court. And now they have arguably the most liberal, medical, program in the country. So
put Oklahoma on your bucket list.
Yeah.
I mean, man, the people of Nebraska just want access to cannabis. Let's let them have it.
Yeah,
guys.
It's pretty basic at this point, right? It doesn't seem like it's a hard ask.
And I say this all the time, like literally all you're doing is banning regulated cannabis. It's not like people in Nebraska aren't getting high or consuming it for medical
order in the mail. I mean, you can buy THC flower from online sellers, right? At this point, I mean, it is. There's no cannabinoids. That's the point, right? Like there's
right.
Yeah, there's nothing stopping consumers from being able to access these things.
People in Nebraska aren't also growing marijuana. Like, of course they are.
Yeah.
So you can only ban regulated cannabis. Okay, let's leave our states behind. So long, Florida. So long, Nebraska. And as I was preparing for this, I don't take you as like a Swiftie, but she's got a song called Florida, and it's just on loop in my head. Okay, so we're going to shift gears and let's take a look at some of the things that are happening at the federal level. I know everyone wants to talk about the presidential election, and of course, we will. But one thing that you and I both agreed on is that, the races in the House and Senate are probably are much more important for purposes of this discussion.
Right.
Party dynamics obviously play such a crucial role in shaping legislative priorities, and that includes cannabis reform. And so changes in control or party leadership will obviously significantly impact the influence and progress of cannabis-related bills and other key legislation. And those margins of control are up for grabs. So I would like to talk about the Senate first. And the Dems currently hold a majority, and it is pivotal for advancing any sort of cannabis reform. But maintaining or really expanding this majority is going to be really crucial for expanding or passing any sort of comprehensive reform. So I'm going to throw a couple questions at you. I guess even if the Dems have control of the Senate, if my maths, I think that we still need some pro-legalization Republicans or moderates to jump on board with us. And so let's talk about that a little. What do the numbers look like here? Are there Democrats that we still need that we can't count on necessarily as well? And who are they? And I think that would be really critical too, because our viewers, right? Like, we are the voters. So we have the ability to try and influence what our elected officials do, going back to the top of the conversation. So yeah, let's just chat it out. Let's talk a little bit about Senate, this election cycle. I'd love to touch on the trifecta of leadership, the Schumer, Booker, and Wyden, and what that looks like. That's if we see any, potential changes. So yeah, let's stream of consciousness. What are your thoughts on the Senate? And what?
Well, I guess we start with what it looks like this cycle, right? Mm-hmm. So Joe Manchin, once he announced that he was retiring, that essentially, Dems currently have a 51-49 majority. Mm-hmm. So taking Joe Manchin not running for re-election gives that seat to Republicans. So Jim Justice is going to be the next senator from West Virginia.
Will you tee up the states, just because not everyone might be on a first last name basis with some of these guys?
Of course, yes. Joe Manchin is the senior senator from West Virginia. He announced his retirement earlier in the year. Okay. The Republican nominee for the West Virginia for the Senate seat in West Virginia is the current governor, Jim Justice, who is heavily favored to win. Yes. And will win. So I don't think no one's expecting an upset in West Virginia this cycle. So that's West Virginia. That knocks Dems down to 50-50 if they defend all of their current seats. So they have I think the most, they are mostly on defense this cycle. I haven't really seen, again, I can't claim to know every poll out there, but I have not really seen any indication that there are any competitive seats that Dems are looking to flip that can possibly flip this cycle. So really, it's just defense. And the next two seats that are the most vulnerable would be John Tester in Montana and Sherrod Brown in Ohio. Ohio, yeah. So I just saw
state I'm from. Ohio and Florida.
There you go.
I picked some interesting places to be from.
Well, very, very important in the last 4 or 5 presidential cycles. So
I kept voting absentee in Florida for as long as I could, until it was very clear that I live in California and I'm not going anywhere. So
yeah, fair enough.
But I tried. I did my best.
So with Brown in Ohio, he is the chair of the Senate Banking Committee, so he also oversees basically the progress of safer banking, that bill, and I'm not aware of any sentiment or any public statement where he's clearly said I'm in favor of federal legalization, but I think he's made enough moves. I think he just toured a legal cannabis facility in a state, right? Because again, Ohio just went adult use, so they just opened it's very strict in that state, but they just opened for adult use sales. So he is now in a position, even as what I consider a moderate Dem, to basically be forced to kind of are you going to be on the wrong side of your voters? And probably, and usually, in most cases, more voters vote in favor of cannabis legalization in states where that's a possibility than they do in favor of any politician that they said that they put into office.
Yeah.
So cannabis legalization tends to win by pretty solid margins when it goes up. So so that's Brown in Ohio, and then you have Tester in Montana. Again, another moderate Dem, in this case, chair of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, and both Brown and Tester came into office in the same cycle in 2006, I believe, and they both and they both had to defend in some very, it's been competitive. Every race that they've had has been competitive, right? Those are not safe seats, in Ohio and Montana. And just like basically the argument, like only Manchin could have held a Democratic seat in West Virginia. I think the argument is the same for Brown and Tester as well. In the current political environment, they're the only Democrats that really have a shot of, holding those seats. So, and again, even though, a lot of people had a lot of very fair criticism of Joe Manchin, in particular his resistance to reforming the filibuster, he did deliver a Democratic majority and key votes when it mattered on like other key Democratic issues. So it does goes to show that it does matter, right? Who's in office, and even with a bare majority like 51, which I mentioned Manchin not being in favor of reforming the filibuster, and you talked about the need for Republican senators. That's why, right? We can't get a legalization bill passed with just a bare majority of 50 or 51. We need at least 10, 9 plus, well, in next year's math, at least 10 Republicans to say yes to legalization.
That feels like a big number to me.
Yes, it is. And I'm not saying that there hasn't been bipartisan legislation in the Senate that's gotten passed. But, it is still a stretch, especially when you consider that not every Democrat is even in favor of legalization at the federal level yet.
Yeah. So, okay. So we need to work on some of those Republicans. And I mean, and again, I'm sort of like jumping around a little bit, but we talked a lot too about sort of just like, what is it going to take to really make change? And I said, like, very glibly, like we just need a lot of the old white men to move on, go to take their retirement, and then like our generation needs to step up. And we're starting to see it. I mean, I know I've got friends that are in city council and school boards and things like that, but the sort of like that progressive pipeline, I think, is honestly, in the next 10 years or so, as we enter our like 40s and 50s, and is where we'll really start to see like a very dynamic shift. Just because, again, like our generation has got a different relationship with cannabis than the one before us. But let's talk a little bit about House as well. The House, what's going on there? Seats open or up for grabs? Like, what shake that magic 8 ball?
So I mean
what do you see?
The House is 435 seats up for election. So obviously the expectation is not that there's going to be a clear sweep one way or the other, but it's going to come down to maybe 5 to 10 seats deciding the majority one way or the other. Sure. And it's not, and so the last cycle, I think Dems lost some seats in New York that they were expecting to hold, that would definitely gave Republicans the majority for this for this last session. Mm-hmm. And I think they're looking at some pickups in California as well. I mean, again, there's a lot of races in the House at any given time. So and most of the seats aren't competitive. So most of them are going to stay just right where they are. I mean, I think you're maybe talking 30 or 40 seats that are really truly competitive, across the entire country. So, but either way, there's no expectation that either the House or the Senate is going to have like a supermajority. Yeah. And again, you don't need a supermajority in the House to get legislation done. You need 218 votes. That is the bare majority.
A road to 218.
And if you have that, and if you can get 218 in the House and 60 in the Senate, right? That's how you get bills passed. At least to the president's desk.
Yeah. But what's sort of wild to me too is that like the Democratic platform does not actually have marijuana legalization on it. So it does have, I did a double check, right? Fact check myself. It has a lot of criminal justice language in there, which is obviously critical and very important. And I don't want to undermine that, because it is deeply important. And we also need legalization. And I think it's sort of wild that it's not on there in this year here of, what are we, 2024? So, why do you think that? And like, what do we need to do to change that, to get our leaders to prioritize this a little bit more?
Again, it's, when
Eric, you have all the answers. Share them with us.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, if I'm going to, break it down into like what I think drives political change, it's the three M's. It's money, media, and masses. Right. Okay. And again, like, cannabis is not a single voter. It's not a top of mind voter issue. Yeah. And voters are not punishing or really rewarding, elected officials at the federal level anyway, for their stances on cannabis, one way or the other, right? So, that has to change, right? There has to be some sort of political, understanding at the level of elected officials, the 535 members of Congress, that, hey, if you're not on the right side of this issue, you're gonna take some real flack. There's going to be a political cost to that, right? And if you're on the right side of the issue, then you're going to be rewarded, right? And that's in political contributions. That's in, positive press. That's in, advocacy groups and organizers and whatever, coming out to help you turn votes out when you need it the next cycle, right? Yeah. That politics is transactional and very, still kind of based around patronage, right? I'm not saying anything, too revolutionary or scandalous here.
We need to be reminded. So, I mean,
exactly. Because again, if you have these kind of expectations that, like, politicians just somehow know how to respond to voter interest, they don't, right? They respond to pressure. Yes. So where they feel pressure, that's how they react. So if they don't feel any pressure, and they haven't, and I don't really see anything changing in the next 2 to 4 years, really, where you're going to start to see, the money and, basically voter pressure come together.
Doesn't really have any money. Right?
They just put $100 million into Florida, so they clearly have some money.
They have some, right? But like, when we're looking at what it takes when you're like California, everybody's just hanging on by a thread, right? So I mean, it's difficult. But obviously, some of the MSOs have a few dollars to spend.
But the MSOs don't really have much of an interest in actual federal legalization, right? Because that would very much undermine, their business position and devalue their assets.
Where's money coming from? Like, everybody lift up your couch cushion, right. You'll find some Doritos and then like some change, maybe Cheerios.
Right. I don't have an answer to where the money comes from, but essentially, until you start basically, like, if it's not going to come from patients and consumers and the sort of general public, which it hasn't ever historically, right? Almost every cannabis legalization, medical or adult use campaign has been funded by elite interests that have just happened to align with, their philanthropy aligns with, this issue, right? Sure. That has been the historical case up until recently, where you now start to see the MSOs, or other business interests really foot the bill for these campaigns. But then again, those campaigns then favor business interests, right? They don't really center patients or consumers in them. Mm-hmm. So, that's the dichotomy, I guess. And that's kind of that's where we're at right now. Like, the business side is driving, adult use medical programs where they don't exist yet. And so they're, writing things that are going to favor them. I think that makes sense. People work in their own self-interest. It's like, I never questioned why people do things.
Sure. Yeah. No,
it's pretty clear in most cases.
Very transparent. Yeah. No one's like, there's not a secret here that we're
right. So I mean, like, okay, people want to make money, people owe a lot of money, right? Like, they, and right now the cannabis industry is not profitable for almost anyone. So, and how do the business interests in the space get to profitability? For the MSOs, it's in expanding, their foothold in these markets where they control, the majority of, the activity. Yeah. For the mom and pops and the small and mid-sized operators, it's probably interstate commerce, right? Being able to, for farmers in Mendocino to be able to sell their,
That's
products,
exactly what I was going to
send
say.
it legally through the mail this time, as opposed to historically.
Right. And it's California's birthright. So like, let's, anyway, I could go on all day. Anyway. Okay. So we cannot like finish a conversation without touching on Harris versus Trump.
Sure.
This entire conversation is about the intersection of law and politics. And so we've got to talk about the presidential election. But I do want to sort of like frame this up with an eye towards rescheduling. And so just a super quick background, in October of 2022, I think it was, President Joe Biden announced a huge policy shift calling for the federal rescheduling of marijuana. And that announcement included a directive to Health and Human Services and the DEA to review marijuana's classification under the Controlled Substance Act. And so HHS, that's a mouthful, was tasked with conducting a review of the current scientific and medical evidence. And the review was aimed to assess, obviously, whether it should remain a Schedule 1 or be rescheduled. And then in August of 2023, right? Yep, like a year and change ago. Gosh, like that feels like yesterday, but then also so long ago at the same time. HHS did indeed recommend that marijuana be reclassified from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. And that's a huge, obviously, a huge shift. And then we have upcoming. And so a lot of people thought things were going to move quickly after that.
2 years is pretty quick for federal bureaucrats, I think. To be honest,
true. Glass half full, Eric. I like that. And so now we'll see here, and a lot of people are disappointed that this didn't happen before the election, although I fully understand why. But December 2nd, mark your calendars, friends. The DEA will hold administrative hearings related to the rescheduling, and then those hearings are part of this formal process required to review and implement changes. And so that's what we're looking for towards, I think, even after that December 2nd and a final rule is issued. And we'll talk about this in a few minutes. Like, I have no doubt that there will be lawsuits. And so, look, what I want to do with the framework of rescheduling in particular, I want to unpack, where does Donald Trump stand on rescheduling? Where does Kamala Harris stand on rescheduling? Let's just start with that.
So I think Trump has made public statements in favor of decriminalization, and I believe he's also said he is going to vote, since he's a Florida resident, for Amendment 3.
Okay.
So which would, and then Harris in the Senate has was an original.
Vote? Isn't he convicted felons?
That's a good question. But that's what he said. He intended to vote that way. So I don't know if that's
sure. And I intend to do something and then I actually do it. So fair. Okay.
Sure.
I don't think we.
Yeah. I mean, again, take a public state from Donald Trump for what that's worth.
Yeah.
On anything. Yeah, so
we're
that's what he said.
On cannabis here because
exactly. So I'm just focusing on what the man said. He said that, but again, what did he do when he was in office? He appointed two of the most anti-cannabis attorney generals in history, between Bill Barr and Jeff Sessions. And Jeff Sessions, who rescinded up to that point, which was like the only real piece of federal recognition of legal cannabis, the Cole Memo. The Biden administration did not put the Cole Memo back into place, but has made other more progress. Again, it's such a low bar, right?
It's such a low bar. But for people who might not know what the Cole Memo said or did, it basically, I mean, in a succinct nutshell, it basically said, "Hey, states, hey DOJ and DEA, if a business or an individual is following its state, well thought out state marijuana laws, then take a hands-off approach." And then it took some of the money away for that purpose. That's like, again, the very in a nutshell. But then Jeff Sessions came and basically rescinded that. And I remember that. So I've been serving the industry since 2009. So there's a lot that's happened. But I remember like very distinctly that coming out and sort of the panic that arose in and fear that people had. And thankfully, nothing really came of it. Again, but it was not a great day. It was not a great day. But
no,
yeah,
I mean, it's clear the DEA has shifted enforcement priorities away from, throwing patients and caregivers in jail like they used to and raiding dispensaries, which is great. The FBI, which is also a part of DOJ, seems way more interested in the political corruption angle side of cannabis, where elected officials, basically taking bribes.
I'm okay with that.
And,
I'm definitely,
which is fine, right?
Pro investigating corruption.
Right. So, I mean, like we can see where the federal government, even though it's within their discretion, because the DEA does have a congressional rider that, the Blumenauer amendment that has been, repeatedly reauthorized that prevents them from enforcing against medical only programs, but obviously doesn't protect any adult use program, right? No. Or laws or anyone operating under those. So, they just choose not to do it, not they can't do it, right? Sure. Even with their current legal authorities. So rescheduling, going back to that, basically where Vice President Harris has been in the past, when she was Senator Harris from California, she was one of the original co-sponsors of the MORE Act, which was, again, a federal legalization plus criminal justice reform bill. So she is, at least, has been, in a very clear, demonstrative way in favor of legalization, which goes far beyond, rescheduling. But to what she said on the campaign trail so far, almost nothing, basically, about cannabis. I think she might have mentioned, the pardon effort, in the Biden administration. Mm-hmm. But again, very small potatoes. I mean, it's very important for the people who received the thousands of people that received those pardons for simple possession of cannabis at the federal level. But it didn't free anyone from prison, certainly, right? Which has been the main priority, especially with, I think we're in the middle of a mass clemency campaign from a lot of criminal justice reform groups like Freedom Grow and, Last Prisoner Project and a lot of organizations that have focused on, ensuring that like the people most directly impacted by criminalization are not, forgotten about, because it's very easy to forget people in prison because they're not, that's the intent, right? They're separated from society. So, and that is, whatever else happens, right? Like that always needs to be a critical component of legalization. So, with rescheduling doesn't affect criminalization almost in really any sense, to the extent that it would impact 280E and, from someone who deals with at the nonprofit level, it does change, or at least leaves it open, at least maybe interpretation open, to allow for in-kind donations of THC products and and for companies that do that, legal companies that do that, to receive a charitable deduction, right?
That'd be great.
Because currently we can do that with CBD, because it's descheduled federally. Sure. But that's not something that's available for anything with more than 0.3% THC, because that's a Schedule I substance under federal law. And so the 280E penalty basically also applies in terms of nonprofit or charitable deductions. And of course, there's the research aspect with rescheduling. The idea that it's going to make it easier, I don't think so. But it does remove, from a veteran perspective, one of the main issues the VA has raised consistently over the last several years, which is that the Schedule I status of cannabis or marijuana, basically prohibits it from doing research. False. Yeah. It can do research on Schedule I substances, and it is right now because it's doing it on psychedelics. So, like, that has never really been the case. And then obviously there's the FDA-approved cannabinoids that it could be doing research on. It is the largest healthcare system in the United States. It serves more than 7 million veterans and beneficiaries healthcare. It employs 400,000 plus people. It's a $370 billion budget. Its third mission is to be the backup healthcare for the United States. Right. It is the best situated entity to do research and the kind of research and development that we want to see. Now, does rescheduling really make that more likely? Somewhat. You might be able to, so I can see a couple very thin strips of silver lining here, because otherwise it's a lateral move.
Yeah. So, I mentioned a few minutes ago, like, I know there are groups that are already mobilizing on both sides to challenge the final rule, but you had mentioned that you think there exists a possibility that we might even see some members of Congress challenge that. So I would love for you to just shed a little bit of light on that as well, and then we'll kind of ask a couple closing questions, and we'll call it.
Yeah, the members of Congress, especially those who were practicing attorneys at one point in their lives, but even those that are not, they regularly will join on amicus briefs and other motions or petitions before the federal courts, or directly sue. I believe Republican members of Congress have sued the Obama administration, for example, over the Affordable Care Act, in the past. Yeah. So there's ways for Republican, or excuse, it's going to be Republicans, right? And it's because this isn't resistance to cannabis legalization is not it's not really much of a bipartisan issue, right? It is almost entirely Republicans. Not saying that there aren't some moderate conservative Democrats,
sure. And we've touched on that. So
we mentioned some of them, right, that aren't necessarily in favor of legalization, but the bulk of the Republican Party, both in the House and the caucuses, both in the House and the Senate, are not in favor of federal legalization at this point. So how that actually ends up panning out, with all of these other different pieces in the mix.
So okay,
we'll see.
Yeah. So besides rescheduling, then. What do you think our likely vehicles are for legalization?
So I think, where Republicans are, I think the best bet for them is something like the States Act, which is now being led by Congressman David Joyce, who's also from Ohio, and he's also one of the Republican co-chairs of the House Cannabis Caucus.
Okay.
So he is, for all intents and purposes, one of the top Republican, if not the top Republican leader on cannabis issues in the House. And so this is his bill. It's, I think, a stepping stone, toward legalization for those Republicans who aren't there yet, which are the vast majority. Yeah. So, and if it works in that manner, it'll be, I'll consider that effective, right? It doesn't deliver on everything that I think most people would consider as far as legalization goes. But again, when we look at, incremental politics, even something as, theoretically slam dunk as like the safer banking, right, has shown to be, 10-year plus process.
I literally cannot figure out, like.
Oh, I can.
So crazy.
Again, like it's not an issue for the vast majority of members of Congress, right? It's bankers in the cannabis industry. That's the only people talking to them about safer banking.
I know, but
and that's just not enough of a constituency to really make a difference.
It's just hello. I don't know. Yeah. I know what you're saying. Obviously, I understand what you're saying.
Right.
But then there's this other part of me that's like, it's not that hard. We just want access to banking. That's all.
I agree. Right. It did make sense in 2014, right, when there were two states that were adult use, where it's like, of course, this seems like a reasonable step, right? Now that you've got adult use cannabis, operators, they should have, some kind of normalized access to banking services, right? Otherwise, right, you're just purely dealing in cash and tax evasion and all these other issues you could avoid if you kind of brought it into.
As an attorney, there's always, you always want to look at asset protection and holding your assets in different companies for various reasons. But it also just creates so many extra layers of corporate compliance and governance that, again, these are businesses that are cash strapped. And if it weren't cannabis, right, again, maybe you would have a single purpose, LLC to hold your property if you're lucky enough to own your property, and then you'd have your cannabis business company. But we've got all these.
The hoops you have to jump through to be a legally compliant cannabis business.
Yes. Okay. So, any final thoughts on other vehicles for rescheduling or federal reform before we kind of close it out?
Right. So I mentioned states, and again, that's what I consider the Republican vehicle. The Democratic vehicle would be and this goes back to your, mentioning the triumvirate of Senators Schumer, Booker, and Wyden. So that vehicle is Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act, the CAOA, and that bill contains most of the MORE Act plus much a much more comprehensive, approach toward regulation. Now, again, no one is ever claiming any of these bills are perfect or the final version of what anyone wants, right? But it is a lot of lobbying is just advancing legislation or like, language or provisions, because these things, once they're introduced and once they kind of gain some traction, you'll see them consistently. Like, so that's why the MORE Act kind of makes up a big chunk of CAOA, because it was a bill that already passed the House. The CAOA also contains other, provisions from other bills, some of which I don't like at all, like the, graduated excise tax. So I mean, there are provisions there that are just like, this doesn't work for a variety of reasons. But that being said, all this stuff is up for negotiation, right? Like, we're not anywhere close to any, whether states or CAOA passing, and getting to the desk of the president. So both bills are, again, they're vehicles. They're ways to start discussion. They're ways to take in, input from other parties, not just members of Congress, but outside groups, right? Advocates, lobbyists, constituents. There's a variety of entities out there that are trying to influence this, this process, for better or worse, right? Like, that's just again, I'm not saying endorsing any of this. It's just, that's just how it is, right? Like,
we're just giving
sky's blue,
giving information here.
People lobby.
Yeah, this is just the facts, ladies and gents. All right. Well, I'd hoped that we might have a little bit of time to talk about the Farm Bill, but I think maybe maybe we can do like a LinkedIn Live Q&A on that another time. But
that's worth a good 10, 15 minutes by itself, to be honest.
Yeah.
All the implications.
so many. But I don't want people to think we forgot about it. We've just run out of time here. So I love to try and end on like a positive note if we can.
Of course.
So like, what's your November 2024 wish list? What do you really just, really hoping to see happen here?
Well, okay. Let's just, I am nonpartisan, but, on the issue of cannabis legalization, a Democratic trifecta would be, basically, that would be the best pathway to do it.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But again, that's whatever that outcome is going to be, even if you somehow pull that off and it's like 50-50 Senate and, a bare majority, maybe 218, 219, Dems in the House, even if you pull that off, those are such thin margins. You're going to need, you're definitely going to need at least, 10 Republicans in the House. So, that's, so even if you get that, it's still going to be,
but we're being
a significant reach. Yes. But those are the, that would be my wish list of like the necessary circumstances that need to exist in order for legalization that even have a shot of making its way, through Congress.
That's right. Well, Eric, thank you so much for your time and your insights. This has been educational and empowering for me, and I'm sure the listeners and viewers. My plug before I turn it over to you for any sort of closing final thoughts is register to vote. If you are not registered, please do so. Vote early, vote by mail. If you have a neighbor who cannot get to the polls, offer to drive them. Please, guys, this is, it's so important. And pay attention to those local races too. Like we didn't touch upon local ballot initiatives, but there are many cities and counties that are looking to change, modify, raise taxes on the cannabis industry. So take a look at those too, be informed, and make sure that you vote. And Eric, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just echo that. Yeah, I think voting is kind of it's like, we talk about like bare minimums, low standards here. That's the bare minimum to be a citizen, right? You gotta, if you can vote, you should.
Absolutely.
And that's true no matter where you live. And vote in all the races and vote. So as much as you can, try. I kind of sometimes pass by the judges. I'll be honest, but
I don't. But
for anything significant,
yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sometimes there's like 40 questions on the ballot, and it's just like, but that being said, I think it's not an unusual. Again, it's never been easier to vote either. So take advantage of the expansion of mail-in ballots and earlier voting in particular. And I would just say, and just remember that regardless of who's in office, right? Like there's a lot of things that still need to happen that are going to happen with or without, who's ever currently in power. Now,
Yep.
they can be helpful or they're going to be a hindrance, but it's going to come down to the people. That's always how it's been with cannabis, especially. This has never been an issue of, purely driven by, a handful of interests in this country. So the better that the community of industry, patients, consumers, workers kind of understand, where they're aligned and,
Yep.
where they stand to gain by working together, I think the more likely that we'll get to legalization maybe in less than 5 years. Fingers crossed.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. I really appreciate it. And until next time, this is Kimberly Simms with Regulated Roots.
Thank you.